Hello and welcome to Trundlebed Tales. Today we're going to be reading a chapter in The Blue Castle by Ellen Montgomery. Now, I have been taking part in the Ellen Montgomery Readathon on Facebook. I'll put a link to it down below in the description. And it's really been great. We've been reading books about Montgomery. There have been discussion questions. There have been posts about neat little things like fashion and clothes and music. And it's really been very enjoyable. And the first book we did was Rilla of Ingleside, which I said when I read the chapter of it that it's one of my favorite books. I think it is the best home front novel of World War I that I have ever read about, and maybe even the best home front novel ever. So I didn't really care which chapter I got of that. I kind of think of it as one big story, and it was just so close to what my family talked about in the stories of Homefront World War I that it's just, as a whole thing, I love it. So I didn't care what chapter I was in. For The Blue Castle, which I'm always recommending to people because it is hilarious. I think it's the funniest book, and I like to listen to it and reread it. And I haven't read it as much as I've read the Laura books, but I've read it an awful lot. And so our chapter today is going to be out of The Blue Castle. Now, like I said, I have two, this is one of my favorite books, and I've got two chapters that I just love to death, that I think are hilarious. And so I asked if I could get one of those, and I couldn't. So what I'm going to be reading today, chapter 9, is the setup for one of my favorite chapters, chapter 10. So if you watch this, please go look up chapter 10 because it is the best. But this is the setup for it today. And you should know about what's going on in the book so far. Valancy Sterling, this is her on the cover. Valancy has always been in sort of a minor branch of a very established, respectable, and well-off family tree. And her little branch over here never had any money. And when Valancy reached a certain age and hadn't gotten married, for one thing, she wasn't allowed to wear white anymore because white is a youthful maiden color. And she wasn't, she was basically considered shunted to the side as an old maid. And her mother and everybody she knows has kind of put a fear in her that she was going to end up old, alone, and poor. And in order to head that off, she was always supposed to be super nice to her relatives, so they would take pity on her and maybe leave her a little money, maybe, take her into their house as a, lady's companion or something. But that would help her from being utterly poor, alone, and old. And she just had this terrible fear of that because she was sort of brought up with it. Well, a couple chapters ago, Valancy wasn't feeling very well, and she went to the doctor, and nobody in her family knows this. And the doctor sent her a letter. And the letter said that she had about a year to live. And Valancy took this as great news. She'd always been afraid of being old, alone, and poor, and now it was not going to happen. She did not have to worry about saving up money. She did not have to worry about being nice to people she didn't like. She could do whatever she wanted to. And this has been a revelation for Valancy. And that's where we're picking them up today. Now, before I get into reading the chapter, I do want to mention one thing. There is a one word. It's used 3 times in this chapter, and I want to make sure you understand it. There is a long tradition in English of taking words that are perfectly useful, that have a very unique meaning, that are so helpful in everyday speech, glomming onto them and changing the meaning completely and not having a word to take their place. It's really very sad, but there's lots of words that's the tale of. And in this chapter, they use the word queer 3 times. And I want to make sure you understand that this is the traditional meaning of the word queer. So if you said someone was a little queer, it would be the same thing as saying they were odd or strange or weird, but it's a little less than that, and it's usually someone that's a little closer to you. So, if it was somebody who is family, you don't say they're odd or strange, but they're, queer or eccentric, or there's a little more connection to it. Like, they might be a little out there, but they're still part of the group. And the fact that they use queer, or at least the narrator picking out of their minds uses queer 3 times, I think shows that Valanci's family maybe has more affection for her than she realizes. But she doesn't realize it here either. She's still in her, I can do whatever I want mode, which is a hoot. So I hope you enjoyed Chapter 9. Uncle Herbert and Aunt Alberta's silver wedding was delicately referred to among the Sterlings during the following weeks as the time we first noticed poor Valancy was a little, you understand. Not for words would any of the Sterlings have said out and out at first that Valancy had gone mildly insane, or even that her mind was slightly deranged. Uncle Benjamin had considered to have gone entirely too far when he had ejaculated, "She's dippy! I tell you, she's dippy!" and was only excused because the outrageousness of Valancy's conduct at the aforesaid wedding dinner. But Mrs. Frederick and Cousin Stickles had noticed a few things that made them uneasy before the dinner. It had begun with the rose bush, of course, and Valancy never was really quite right again. She did not seem to worry in the least over the fact that her mother was not speaking to her. You would never suppose she noticed it at all. She had flatly refused to take either purple pills or Redfern's bitters. She had announced coolly that she did not intend to answer to the name of Doss any longer. She had told Cousin Stickles that she wished she would give up wearing the brooch that had Cousin Artemis Stickles' hair in it. She had moved her bed in her room to the opposite corner. She had read Magic of Wings Sunday afternoon. When Cousin Stickles had rebuked her, Valancy had said indifferently, "Oh, I forgot it was Sunday," and had gone on reading it. Cousin Stickles had seen a terrible thing. She had caught Valancy sliding down the banister. Cousin Stickles did not tell Mrs. Frederick this. Poor Amelia was worried enough as it was. But it was Valancy's announcement on Saturday night that she was not going to the Anglican church anymore that broke through Mrs. Frederick's stony silence. "Not going to church anymore? Doss, have you absolutely taken leave?" "Oh, I'm going to church," said Valancy airily. "I'm going to the Presbyterian church. But to the Anglican church I will not go." This was even worse. Mrs. Frederick had recourse to tears, having found that outraged majesty had ceased to be effective. What do you have against the Anglican church?" she sobbed. "Nothing. Only just that you've always made me go there. If you'd made me go to the Presbyterian church, I'd want to go to the Anglican." "Is that a nice thing to say to your mother? Oh, how true it is that it is sharper than a serpent's tooth to have a thankless child." "Is that a nice thing to say to your daughter?" said an unrepentant Valancy. So Valancy's behavior at the silver wedding was not quite the surprise to Mrs. Frederick and Christine Stickles than it was to the rest. They were doubtful about the wisdom of taking her, but concluded it would make talk if they didn't. Perhaps she would behave herself. And so far, no outsider suspected that there was anything queer about her. By a special mercy of Providence, it had poured torrents Sunday morning, so Valancy had not carried out her hideous threat to go to the Presbyterian church. Valancy would not have cared in the least if they had left her at home. These family celebrations were all hopelessly dull, but the Sterlings always celebrated everything. It was a long-established custom. Even Mrs. Frederick gave a dinner party on her wedding anniversary, and Cousin Stickles had friends in to supper on her birthday. Valancy hated these entertainments because they had to pinch and save and contrive for weeks afterward in order to afford it. But she wanted to go to the silver wedding anyway. It would hurt Uncle Herbert's feelings if she stayed away, and she rather liked Uncle Herbert. Besides, she wanted to look over all her relatives from her new angle, and it would be a perfect place to make public her Declaration of Independence if occasion offered. "Put on your brown silk dress," said Mrs. Sterling. As if there were anything else to put on, Valancy had only the one festive dress, the snuffy brown silk Aunt Isabel had given her. Aunt Isabel had decreed that Valancy should never wear colors. They did not become her. When she was young, they had allowed her to wear white, but that had been tacitly dropped for some years. Valancy put on the brown silk. It had a high collar and long sleeves. She had never had a dress with a low neck and elbow sleeves, although they had been worn even in Deerwood for over a year. But she did not do her hair in a pompadour. She knotted it on her neck and pulled it out over her ears. She thought it became her, only the little knot was so absurdly small. Mrs. Frederick resented the hair, but decided it was wisest to say nothing on the eve of the party. It was so important that Valancy should be kept in a good humor, if possible, until it was over. Mrs. Frederick did not reflect that this was the first time in her life that she thought it necessary to consider Valancy's humors. But then Valancy had never been queer before. On their way to Uncle Herbert's, Mrs. Frederick and Cousin Stickles walking in front, Valancy trotting meekly along behind, Roaring Abel drove past them, drunk as usual, but not at the roaring stage, just drunk enough to be excessively polite. He raised his disreputable old tartan cap with the air of a monarch saluting his subjects, and swept them a grand bow. Mrs. Frederick and Cousin Stickles dared not cut Roaring Abel altogether. He was the only person in Deerwood who could be got to do odd jobs of carpentering and repairing when they needed to be done, so it would not do to offend him. But they responded with only the stiffest, slightest of bows. Roaring Abel must be kept in his place. Valancy, behind them, did a thing they were fortunately spared seeing. She smiled gaily and waved her hand at Roaring Abel. Why not? She had always liked the old sinner. He was such a jolly, picturesque, unashamed reprobate, and stood out against the drab respectability of Deerwood and its customs like a flame-red flag of revolt and protest. Only a few nights ago, Abel had gone through Deerwood in the wee smalls, shouting oaths at the top of his stentorian voice, which could be heard for miles, and lashing his horse into a furious gallop as he tore along prim, proper Elm Street. "Yelling and blaspheming like a fiend," shuddered Cousin Stickles at the breakfast table. "I cannot understand why the judgment of the Lord has not fallen upon that man long ere this," said Mrs. Frederick petulantly, as if she thought Providence was very dilatory and ought to have a gentle reminder. He'll be picked up dead some morning. He'll fall under his horse's hoofs and be trampled to death," said Cousin Stickles reassuringly. Valancy had said nothing, of course, but she wondered to herself if Roaring Abel's periodic sprees were not his futile protest against the poverty and drudgery and monotony of his existence. She went on dream sprees in her blue castle. Roaring Abel, having no imagination, could not do that. His escapes from reality had to be concrete. So she waved at him today with a sudden fellow feeling. And Roaring Abel, not too drunk to be astonished, nearly fell off his seat in amazement. By this time they had reached Maple Avenue and Uncle Herbert's house, a large, pretentious structure peppered with meaningless bay windows and porches. A house that always looked like a stupid, prosperous, self-satisfied man with warts on his face. "A house like that," said Valancy solemnly, "is a blasphemy." Mrs. Frederick was shaken to her soul. What had Valancy said? Was it profane, or only just queer? Mrs. Frederick took off her hat in Aunt Alberta's spare room with trembling hands. She had made one more feeble attempt to avert disaster. She held Valancy back on the landing as Cousin Stickles went downstairs. "Won't you try and remember you're a lady?" she pleaded. "Oh, if only there were only hope of being able to forget it," said Valancy wearily. Mrs. Frederick felt that she had not deserved this from Providence. And that's the end of Chapter 9. Chapter 10, as I say, is the party, and it is my favorite chapter, and I hope you go and read it. Thank you for joining me today on Trundlebed Tales. This is sort of a little different episode since it was a reading, and now I think whether we read it or not in the group, I am going to have to look up Quarantine at Alexander Abraham's to see if I can read that with the copyright date, because that is my favorite short story, and it is also by Ellen Montgomery, and it is also hilarious. I hope that you'll look for me all around the web at Trundlebed Tales, on this video channel, on Blog Talk Radio for my podcast, on my blog and my website at Trundlebed Tales, on Twitter and on Facebook and on Instagram. Also, under Sarah Utoff, Trundlebed Tales. I hope I'll see you real soon, and remember to imagine your own blue castle.